Margaret, 72 years old, sat at the head of the long oak dining table that had been in her family for decades. She was a retired schoolteacher, widowed for nearly 20 years, and for most of her life, she believed her daughter Elise was her greatest achievement. That night, though, she realized she had been wrong. Elise stood with her glass of wine raised, a practiced smile on her face, and slid a folded piece of paper across the table toward her. Margaret thought it was a note of gratitude, maybe a sweet surprise. But when she opened it, her stomach dropped. It wasn't a note, it was legal papers, written in cold black ink. Elise was asking her to sign away her home, her bank account, her entire life's security. Margaret's throat tightened, her hands trembling so hard she could barely hold the paper. She looked up at Elise, who gave her that same fake smile she used on strangers. Everyone around the table kept eating, oblivious. Margaret felt trapped in a nightmare. But before she could speak, her best friend Clara, who had insisted on coming to the dinner that night, leaned over and plucked the paper out of Margaret's hand. She squinted, her face paling. Then her eyes widened in shock. "Do you know what she's trying to make you sign?" she asked, her voice cutting through the chatter like a knife. The room went silent. Forks froze midair. Elise's smile cracked into something darker, something ugly. Margaret felt her world tilt. Betrayal like she had never imagined was staring at her in the face, and it was coming from the one person she had lived her entire life for. Elise's hand twitched across the table, as though she might snatch the papers back. Margaret's pulse raced. She could feel the eyes of every family member burning into her, waiting to see what she would do. And just like that, everything Margaret thought she knew about her daughter came crashing down. The room grew heavy, like it was holding its breath. Margaret wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but her voice caught in her chest. Elise's lips curled into a smirk, a challenge. Clara's hand squeezed Margaret's trembling one beneath the table. Margaret could feel her friend's silent message, "Don't give in." But the truth was Margaret didn't know what to do. She had sacrificed everything for Elise, and now she was being cornered like prey by her own child. What could a mother say in a moment like that? What could she do when her blood betrayed her? And then Clara, still clutching the papers, pushed back her chair, standing tall. She read the first lines out loud for everyone to hear. The words sliced through Margaret's heart. Transfer of property, full guardianship, access to pension. Gasps echoed around the room. Elise's face hardened. Margaret's world spun. That was the moment Margaret knew her daughter hadn't just wanted her love. She wanted her life. But how had things come to this point? How had a little girl Margaret once cradled in her arms turned into a woman willing to strip her mother of everything she owned? To answer that, we need to go back. Because this betrayal didn't start tonight. It had been building, piece by piece, for decades. And if you think this dinner was the most shocking part, wait until you see where the story truly began. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal will make you question just how well you really know the people sitting at your own dinner table. Margaret wasn't always the fragile woman gripping her chair in shock. Decades earlier, she had been strong, hopeful, and determined to raise her daughter with love after losing her husband in a car accident when Elise was only 5. Margaret worked 2 jobs, teaching during the day and cleaning offices at night, to keep food on the table. She gave up on her dream of traveling, pouring every ounce of energy into Elise's future. She remembered Elise's bright smile on her first day of school, the way she used to run into her arms. Margaret thought that kind of love could never fade. But time has a way of twisting things. When Elise became a teenager, something shifted. She stopped holding her mother's hand in public, stopped introducing her proudly. Margaret brushed it off as normal teenage behavior. She thought all kids pulled away at that age. One afternoon, Margaret brought homemade cookies to Elise's high school, proud to surprise her. But instead of gratitude, Elise rolled her eyes and said, "Mom, could you not embarrass me like this?" The sting of that moment never really left Margaret. It was the first crack in the picture-perfect daughter she thought she was raising. Still, Margaret pushed the doubts away. She told herself Elise would grow out of it, that one day her daughter would understand the sacrifices she had made. But deep down, she couldn't shake the unease. Was Elise ashamed of her? Was her love never enough? Those questions haunted Margaret late at night, and if only she had listened to her gut back then, maybe the dinner years later would not have shocked her so deeply. But love has a way of blinding us, doesn't it? And then came the man who would change everything for the worse. By the time Elise was in her 20s, Margaret thought the worst of their rough patch was behind them. Elise had graduated college, found a career, and even introduced Margaret to her boyfriend, Richard. At first, Margaret wanted to believe he was a good man. He was polite, well-dressed, a lawyer with a confident smile. Elise seemed smitten, and Margaret wanted her daughter to have a stable life. But something about Richard never sat right with her. His eyes were too calculating, his compliments too rehearsed. One evening, while Margaret was in the kitchen, she overheard him whispering to Elise. His words chilled her to the bone. "Your mother's money is the only thing she's good for." Margaret froze, clutching the counter, her heart pounding. She wanted to storm into the room and demand an explanation, but fear kept her quiet. Would Elise defend her? Or worse, would she agree? That night, Margaret lay awake, replaying those words in her head. Money? Was that all her daughter's life with her amounted to? But instead of confronting Elise, Margaret convinced herself she had misheard. After all, no daughter could be so cold, right? But deep down, the seed of doubt had been planted. And like all seeds, it was only a matter of time before it grew into something far darker. Because Richard wasn't just a passing boyfriend. He was about to become Elise's husband. And with him, greed would take root in ways Margaret never saw coming. Retirement was supposed to be Margaret's reward for a lifetime of sacrifice. After decades of teaching and saving every penny, she finally had a small pension and a home she owned outright. She pictured herself gardening in the mornings, maybe traveling with friends, living peacefully at last. But peace didn't last long. Elise began visiting more often, smiling sweetly as she asked if Margaret had thought about downsizing. Richard chimed in with talks of financial planning. Margaret brushed them off, proud of the life she had built. But then the phone call started. Strangers asking if she planned to sell her home, offering cash. Margaret was confused. How did they even get her number? Each call left her unsettled. Could Elise have told them? She didn't want to believe it. Mothers don't raise daughters to betray them, right? Still, unease tugged at her. She dismissed it, clinging to hope. But the truth was already unraveling in ways Margaret couldn't see. Because while she dreamed of gardening, Elise and Richard were already plotting how to uproot her life for their own gain. And soon, their whispers would turn into bold moves that no amount of motherly love could excuse. Clara came back into Margaret's life like a sudden light after years of darkness. They had been childhood friends, inseparable until life pulled them into different paths. Clara had moved to another state, married, divorced, lived through her own storms, and now returned to town with fire still in her eyes. She was bold, outspoken, and sharp, exactly the kind of friend Margaret needed, but didn't know she was missing. When Clara stopped by the house one morning, she immediately noticed the tension clinging to Margaret like a heavy coat. "You look tired, Maggie," she said, using the nickname only she ever used. "What's going on?" Margaret brushed it off, but Clara wasn't one to let things slide. Over coffee, Margaret admitted Elise and Richard were hovering too much, always talking about her house, her future, her money. Clara leaned back, arms crossed, and said bluntly, "Don't you see what's happening? They're circling you." Margaret frowned, defensive. She wanted to believe her daughter loved her, not her bank account. But Clara's words dug under her skin. And later, at Elise's home, Clara's suspicions grew even sharper when she spotted a manila envelope tucked halfway under a stack of bills on the counter. She slid it out just enough to glimpse the bold black letters. Power of attorney. Clara's pulse quickened. She slipped it back before anyone noticed, but her heart hammered. She knew then that Elise's smile hid something dangerous. Clara warned Margaret that night, voice low and urgent. But Margaret shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "She's my daughter, Clara. I can't believe she'd do this to me." Clara squeezed her hand, her tone fierce. "You don't have to believe it for it to be true." And that was the hook Margaret couldn't ignore. Because deep down, she already knew her daughter had changed. She just didn't want to face it. The pressure started with little things. Elise began bringing papers over for Margaret to sign, saying they were routine, just for emergencies. Margaret hesitated, staring at the fine print, but Elise reassured her with that sweet practice tone. "It's just to make sure you're taken care of, Mom." Against her better judgment, Margaret signed one. Days later, she got a bank notice in the mail. Her savings had been moved into a joint account she never authorized. Panic clawed at her chest. She rushed to Elise's house, papers trembling in her hand. "What is this?" she demanded. Elise didn't even blink. She looked Margaret straight in the eye and said coldly, "You'll thank me later." The words cut like a knife. Margaret stormed out, heart racing, but the damage was done. Elise had control of more than Margaret ever intended. Alone in her kitchen that night, Margaret cried until her chest hurt. How could her own daughter betray her like this? And yet, she still clung to the hope that maybe Elise had meant well. But Clara wouldn't let her drown in denial. She showed up with coffee the next morning, ready to fight. "This isn't love, Maggie. This is control." Margaret wanted to argue, but the bank notice on the table said otherwise. And then the unthinkable happened. Elise showed up that evening with a realtor's card in her hand, casually suggesting Margaret think about senior living communities. Margaret stared at the card in disbelief. Elise was no longer hiding it. She wanted the house. She wanted everything. Margaret's hands shook as she tore the card in half, but Elise only smirked. That was the moment Margaret realized her daughter was done pretending. The stress weighed on Margaret's health. She began losing weight, her hands unsteady, her nights restless. Every cough, every dizzy spell, Elise used as ammunition. "See, Mom? You're not safe living alone." The words stung more than any illness. Clara, on the other hand, became Margaret's lifeline. She cooked for her, sat with her, reminded her she wasn't crazy. But Elise kept pushing harder. One night, after a small argument, Elise finally snapped. Her face twisted with rage and she shouted, "You're nothing but dead weight." Margaret staggered back, as if slapped. Her knees went weak, her chest burning. Those words weren't just anger. They were the truth Elise had been hiding all along. Margaret turned away, tears streaming down her face, but inside her heart, something shifted. Love was still there, but it was breaking, cracking under the weight of betrayal. Clara found her the next day, hollow-eyed and trembling. "I can't take this anymore," Margaret whispered. Clara leaned forward, her voice steady as stone. "Then it's time to fight back." Clara's idea was simple but dangerous. They needed proof. They needed to know exactly what Elise and Richard were planning. Margaret was terrified, but Clara was relentless. She arranged a meeting with her old friend, a lawyer named Henry, who still remembered Margaret from years ago. Together, they laid out the papers Elise had slipped under her nose, the strange bank notices, the constant pressure. Henry's face darkened as he flipped through the documents. "This isn't just manipulation," he said. "They're preparing for full guardianship. Once she has that, you won't have a say in anything, not your home, not your money, not even your medical decisions." Margaret's stomach turned. Guardianship? Her own daughter wanted legal power to treat her like a child. Clara squeezed her shoulder, eyes blazing. "We're going to stop this, Maggie. But we need to catch them in the act." Margaret nodded weakly, fear knotting in her stomach. She didn't know if she had the strength, but she knew she couldn't sit back and let Elise win. The plan was forming, but danger was coming faster than they expected. Elise called a week later, her voice unusually sweet. "Mom, we're having a big family dinner. It's time to celebrate." Something about the tone made Margaret's skin crawl. She knew Elise too well. Her smiles always came before the storm. Clara insisted on going with her. "I'm not letting you walk into that lion's den alone," she said. Margaret agreed, though her hands trembled as she set down the phone. That evening, as they arrived at Elise's grand home, the dining table glowed with candles and fine china. Family members filled the room, laughter floating in the air, but Margaret felt none of it. Her eyes darted to Elise and Richard, standing together like predators dressed as hosts. Clara leaned close, whispering, "Stay sharp. Something's coming." And then Margaret heard it. Elise leaned toward Richard, her voice low but not low enough. "Tonight, she won't leave the table until it's signed." Margaret's blood ran cold. Signed? What did Elise mean? She glanced at Clara, who had also heard. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing like a hunter spotting prey. The trap was set, and Margaret was sitting right in the center of it. The dinner began like a performance, with Elise and Richard playing the perfect hosts. Platters of food were passed around, glasses clinked, and laughter filled the room. Margaret sat stiffly, her fork barely moving, her eyes locked on her daughter. Something about Elise's smile felt rehearsed, like a mask ready to slip. The tension grew heavier with every second until Elise finally rose from her chair. She raised her glass in a toast, her voice sweet and polished. Then she leaned down and slid a folded piece of paper across the table toward her mother. "For you, Mom," she said, her eyes sharp despite the sugary tone. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for it, dread curling in her stomach. The room seemed to fade, every sound dull except the thudding of her own heartbeat. She wanted to crumple the paper, but before she could open it, Clara's hand shot out, snatching it from the table. Clara unfolded it and read the words. Her face drained of color, then hardened like stone. She rose from her seat, her voice echoing over the table. "Do you all know what she's asking her mother to sign?" Every fork froze. Every eye turned. Elise's smile cracked, her mask slipping at last. Clara's voice shook as she read the first lines. Transfer of property, full financial control, guardianship. A gasp rolled through the room like thunder. Margaret's chest tightened, her world spinning. Elise's face twisted, first with embarrassment, then with rage. "That's not what it looks like," she snapped, reaching for the papers, but Clara held them high. Margaret tried to speak, her voice weak, her body trembling, but nothing came out. She felt the ground slipping from beneath her. Elise slammed her glass down, red wine spilling across the tablecloth like blood. "You don't understand. I was protecting you, Mother," she shouted. Margaret's heart cracked as she saw the venom in her daughter's eyes. She had raised this woman, loved her more than her own life. And yet here she was, being stripped of her dignity in front of her entire family. Clara's hand found Margaret's beneath the table, steady and strong. "Don't let her take everything, Maggie," she whispered. Margaret swallowed hard, the weight of decades pressing down on her. She looked at Elise, her voice breaking as she asked, "Is this what you think of me?" The room erupted in noise. Richard slammed his napkin on the table and stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. Cousins and siblings demanded answers, their voices sharp with disbelief. Elise tried to paint herself as the victim, her voice trembling as she claimed she only wanted what was best for her mother. But the truth was already laid bare on the table in black and white. Margaret's tears fell freely now, her hands trembling as she pushed her chair back. "You would steal from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elise's face hardened into defiance. "You've had your life, Mother. It's time you let me have mine." Margaret felt something inside her snap. The years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights working 2 jobs, the dreams she gave up just to raise Elise. All of it boiled up in her chest. She stood, her frail frame shaking but her voice sharp. "You will not take what I bled for." The words hung in the air like a blade. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. Everyone was watching, waiting. Elise's jaw clenched, her eyes burning with fury. Margaret turned to Clara, her decision made. She was done being silent. The days that followed were filled with whispers and shock. News spread quickly through the family, and Elise found herself alone, abandoned by those who once admired her. Richard kept his distance, his calls short, his eyes colder by the day. Margaret, meanwhile, found strength she thought she had lost. With Clara at her side, she visited Henry, the lawyer, and changed everything. Elise's name was removed from her will, her access revoked, every paper she had tried to trick her mother into signing destroyed. Margaret felt grief like a fresh wound, but there was also a strange, new freedom. When Elise confronted her, demanding answers, Margaret stood tall. "You betrayed me," she said, her voice steady, "and I will not let betrayal inherit my life." Elise sneered, spitting out words meant to wound. "If you walk out that door, don't ever call me your daughter again." Margaret's heart ached, but she didn't flinch. She turned and walked away, Clara's hand steady at her back. Months passed. Margaret's home bloomed with color again, her garden alive with flowers she planted herself. She laughed with Clara on the porch, her evenings filled with peace instead of dread. Elise, on the other hand, spiraled. With no inheritance and no control, her marriage to Richard crumbled. He left her without warning, taking what little they had. She called once, her voice desperate, begging Margaret for help. Margaret listened in silence, then quietly hung up the phone. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. For the first time in her life, she chose herself. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret stood in her garden, the gate creaking as she closed it. She held the key in her hand, the metal warm from the setting sun. She whispered to herself, "This time, the key stays with me." A quiet smile spread across her face, not of triumph, but of peace. She had given life to a daughter who tried to steal it, but she had reclaimed her power in the end. And if you take anything from Margaret's story, let it be this: love your children, but never at the cost of your dignity. Protect what you've built, because not every smile means love, and not every hand extended means help. Some are waiting to take everything the moment you let go. So hold your key tight, because your life is yours and no one else's.